They seized gold, not with pirates or storms, but with pens and orders signed in silence. $300 million worth of Burkina Faso's treasure vanished into the vaults of Europe, not by law, but by politics. It was a lesson scripted in Washington, a warning voiced by Donald Trump himself. If Africa dares to step outside the system, its wealth will never leave the port. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the news struck like thunder across the Sahel. That gold was not profit. It was bread, classrooms, medicines, the very seed of tomorrow. To see it snatched away was not business. It was robbery. And robbery in daylight is not law. It is humiliation. But humiliation can plant a different seed. Across Ouagadougou, anger did not wither into despair. It ignited. The miners marched with tools in hand, students raised their banners, and mothers cried that the future of their children was locked in someone else's vault. Out of that fury rose a single question. If one small landlocked nation can resist, what stops the rest? Stay with us. This is not just a story of gold. It is the beginning of a struggle for dignity. Subscribe now and walk with us through the storm. The story began not in the goldfields of Burkina Faso, but on the docks of Europe. A shipment worth $300 million was stopped, its containers locked and sealed under the gaze of customs officials. No pirates, no storms, no accident. The truth was harsher. It was politics. Under quiet but firm orders from Washington, the gold was never allowed to sail on. From the White House podium, Donald Trump's voice cut through the noise, sharp and unapologetic. If Africa wanted the benefits of global markets, he declared, it must first pay its dues. To many outside the continent, it sounded like ordinary policy. To those in Ouagadougou, it was something else entirely. It was theft disguised as law. President Ibrahim Traoré felt the blow not in theory, but in reality. The shipment was meant to fuel the nation's future, to buy grain for families, to fund hospitals, to train teachers. Now those plans collapsed in an instant. Crowds filled the streets of the capital, their chants rising like fire through the markets and alleys. They steal in daylight and call it law, shouted one man. For the people of Burkina Faso, the insult cut deeper than numbers. It was about sovereignty itself. The International Monetary Fund had long claimed Africa's resources as collateral for debts written decades ago in the halls of Paris and Washington. Buried in contracts, these clauses gave creditors leverage far beyond economics. Gold, oil, uranium, the lifeblood of nations, could be frozen or seized if loans were not repaid on schedule. In this case, the logic was laid bare. The gold of Burkina Faso was no longer seen as belonging to its people. It was reclassified as a guarantee, a hostage for debts that had already drained more than they ever gave. A farmer interviewed on local radio voiced the collective rage. We never signed those loans. Why should our gold pay for them? A teacher added, if they take the gold, they are taking the future of our children. These were not just sound bites. They were echoes of a nation waking up to a truth too long ignored. That freedom written on paper means little if wealth remains chained in foreign vaults. Inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere grew heavier by the hour. Advisors debated whether to negotiate, to plead for the gold's release, to compromise. But Traoré's answer was blunt. This is not about debt, he told them. This is about control. If we bend today, tomorrow there will be nothing left to stand on. His words struck like iron. For the first time, the cabinet realized this was not a financial dispute, but an assault on sovereignty. In the streets, the symbolism grew impossible to ignore. Miners carried their tools high, declaring that their sweat would no longer be turned into ransom. Students painted murals showing Africa's resources bound in chains, demanding that the cycle be broken. Mothers held their children close, asking how a nation could feed itself if its bread was sold before it was baked. Western media framed the crisis differently. Commentators in Europe spoke of instability, irresponsibility, and risk. On CNN, the story was narrated as yet another sign of African recklessness. But to those living the reality, the narrative could not be further from the truth. The seizure was not a warning of instability. It was proof that Africa's stability had been built on fragile foundations laid in foreign capitals. What began as the stopping of containers at a port was becoming more than a diplomatic spat. It was transforming into a test of will. Could a young nation, long dismissed as poor and dependent, assert its right to control its own treasure? Could one shipment of gold ignite a broader movement across a continent? The answer was not yet clear. But as the dust settled over Ouagadougou, one fact remained undeniable. This was no longer just about bullion. It was about dignity. What began as a seizure of gold was about to ignite a battle over the soul of Africa. Inside the palace of Ouagadougou, silence weighed heavier than gold. Ministers shuffled papers, some whispering that perhaps diplomacy might bring the shipment back. "We can negotiate repayment schedules," one said nervously. Another proposed a compromise with the IMF. But Ibrahim Traoré, calm yet unyielding, rose to his feet. His voice carried no hesitation. "They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose, with gold mined from our blood. If we surrender today, tomorrow there will be nothing left to defend." His words cut through the chamber like a blade. For the first time, his cabinet understood that this was not a quarrel over accounts. It was a battle for sovereignty itself. Outside those walls, the people had already decided. The streets swelled with voices, not of confusion, but of defiance. Miners marched with their tools raised high, symbols of sweat and sacrifice. Students filled campuses with chants demanding an end to IMF dependency. Mothers who struggled daily to buy bread shouted in markets, "Is this ours or is it theirs?" Even in the barracks, soldiers muttered uneasily, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" The atmosphere grew electric, as if a spark had leapt from one heart to another. This was no longer about $300 million. It was about the soul of a nation. Western media painted a different picture. On CNN, the headline framed Traoré as reckless. European commentators warned of chaos. Talk shows questioned whether a leader so young could manage the weight of international law. Yet on African streets, the narrative inverted. Where outsiders saw instability, Africans saw courage. Where foreign analysts predicted collapse, ordinary people whispered of awakening. In the Sahel, history had often been written in the language of humiliation, contracts signed in Paris, conditions dictated in Washington, and resources ferried through ports that did not belong to Africans. But now humiliation was fueling something more dangerous to the old order: unity. The seizure that was meant to break Burkina Faso was instead uniting its neighbors. In Bamako, Malian envoys rushed to Ouagadougou, declaring, "Your gold is our fight too." In Niamey, Nigerian ministers spoke of uranium reserves treated as collateral for debts never agreed by their people. Across the Sahel, the same story echoed. Resources seized, contracts rewritten, futures mortgaged. The African response was visceral. In markets, murals showed chains snapping. On the airwaves, callers demanded that Africa keep its gold within Africa. Youth groups painted slogans on city walls: "Our gold is not your guarantee." Farmers, though poor, pledged to contribute to a people's fund, declaring that dignity was worth more than any loan. The sense of betrayal transformed into a wave of resistance. Even the most cautious voices began to waver. Diplomacy sounded less like compromise and more like surrender. Each threat from Washington and Brussels only added fuel to the fire. And in the middle of it all stood Traoré, no longer just a president of one landlocked nation, but a symbol of something larger. His speeches rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. "This is not about debt. This is about control," he declared again, this time to the people. "If they succeed, Africa will never own its tomorrow." The words spread through radios, WhatsApp groups, and gatherings under the Sahel sky. To the West, it was rhetoric. To Africa, it was truth. This was the breaking point. The West believed it had forced Africa to its knees. But what they underestimated was the power of humiliation turned into defiance. The West thought it had made Africa kneel. Instead, it had awakened unity. The days that followed the seizure did not bring calm. Instead, they unraveled a chain of consequences that touched every layer of society. In Ouagadougou, families who had expected new supplies of grain and medicine realized the shelves would remain bare. Small businesses that relied on trade credit found their accounts frozen as European banks tightened restrictions. Insurance companies refused to cover shipments bound for the Sahel. Even humanitarian aid was delayed under the pretext of compliance checks. Burkina Faso was not simply facing a financial setback. It was entering a storm. Farmers feared their harvest would rot without markets. Teachers worried about salaries. Hospitals anticipated shortages of essential drugs. This was the immediate face of the crisis, an economic suffocation designed to break morale. But instead of breaking, the people adapted. They began to speak of self-reliance. Cooperatives were formed in villages to pool resources. Farmers pledged portions of their harvest to community granaries. Students organized fundraisers to support striking miners. The crisis, which was meant to divide, was knitting society together with unexpected threads of solidarity. Inside government halls, debates grew fierce. Some advisors still urged compromise, fearing sanctions would crush the fragile economy. Yet others argued that bending now would only invite further humiliation. Ibrahim Traoré listened to them all, but his conviction did not waver. They already suffocate us, he told his ministers. Did the IMF save us when reserves were frozen? Did sanctions feed our people? No. They steal with one hand and offer loans with the other. Enough. Out of this defiance emerged a radical proposal to stop sending gold through European ports and instead build an African gold reserve. It was not just a logistical suggestion. It was a political declaration. For decades, Africa's wealth had flowed outward, refined elsewhere, stored elsewhere, traded under someone else's rules. Now, for the first time, leaders dared to imagine a vault on African soil, guarded by African soldiers, beyond the reach of Brussels or Washington. The idea spread quickly. Newspapers in Ouagadougou printed bold headlines, "Gold seized," "Nation betrayed." Radio hosts replayed Trump's words, "Africa must pay its dues," until they rang like a challenge. Youths painted murals of chains breaking apart, with gold bars shining in African hands. Miners carried their pickaxes through the streets, chanting that their labor should serve their children, not creditors overseas. What had begun as anger was evolving into pride. The very act of resistance gave people a sense of ownership they had long been denied. "If they fear it this much," a student wrote in a viral post, "then it must be our only hope." The implications for politics were profound. For years, Burkina Faso had been portrayed internationally as fragile, dependent, unstable. Yet in the crucible of this crisis, it discovered a new center of gravity. Other Sahel states, Mali, Niger, Guinea, leaned closer, voicing solidarity. Leaders who once hesitated now spoke of pooling resources, contributing uranium, bauxite, or oil to the same vision. The more Europe dismissed the plan as fantasy, the more tangible it became in African minds. The humiliation of having gold seized abroad had struck too deep. To accept the old system now felt like surrendering dignity itself. Even within the military, whispers of doubt gave way to support. Officers who once worried about sanctions began to declare loyalty to the people's cause. Civilian organizations formed watch groups to expose propaganda and prevent division. Opposition groups funded by outside actors found their messages drowned out by the roar of unity. And so a paradox emerged. The West had seized Burkina Faso's gold to enforce obedience. Instead, it ignited a fire of defiance, a solidarity that neither contracts nor sanctions could extinguish. To international observers, this was reckless. To those who lived it, it was liberation in its earliest form. For the first time in generations, Africa was not only resisting, it was planning. One journalist summarized it in a phrase that spread quickly through local media. What began as a financial dispute is now an Ibrahim Traoré coup against dependency itself. The question that lingered was no longer whether the gold could be returned. It was whether Africa could seize this moment to reshape its future. Could one reserve of gold become the cornerstone of a revolution? From Washington, the message was framed as law. At a press conference, Donald Trump declared that if Africa wished to sit at the table of global trade, it must first obey the rules. To him, those rules were simple: IMF contracts, dollar repayment, collateral in the form of Africa's resources. Anything else was chaos. His words, amplified across Western media, painted the confrontation not as robbery, but as discipline. In Brussels and Paris, officials spoke of stability and compliance, but their actions betrayed the rhetoric. Banks froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso. Insurance firms refused coverage for shipments leaving the Sahel. Cargo vessels destined for Asia were stopped for inspections. In truth, this was not regulation. It was economic warfare cloaked in technical language. European commentators warned of disaster. Newspapers called the African gold reserve a reckless gamble. Analysts predicted famine and collapse. On talk shows, Traoré was labeled too young, too radical, too dangerous. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to fracture the unity that was growing in Ouagadougou. But while the West tightened its grip, other hands reached out. In Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, the crisis was followed with sharp interest. BRICS envoys arrived quietly in Burkina Faso, offering direct gold purchases, refining technology, and most importantly, alternative markets free from Washington's pressure. These were not gestures of charity, but signs that the balance of global power was shifting. If the West closed its doors, new corridors were opening to the East. Across Africa, the perception began to change. The narrative of recklessness gave way to one of resilience. What outsiders dismissed as fantasy was seen by Africans as survival. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders pledged to support the initiative. In the streets, people no longer spoke only of lost gold, but of a wider awakening, a Burkina Faso revolution that symbolized the desire of an entire continent to own its destiny. The symbolism resonated beyond the Sahel. Commentators in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya debated openly whether a pan-African financial system could shield the continent from Western manipulation. On social media, the hashtag #OurGoldOurAfrica spread like wildfire, linking protests in Ouagadougou to conversations in Johannesburg and Lagos. To Western diplomats, the threat was obvious. If Africa truly built a gold reserve independent of IMF oversight, the leverage of decades would crumble. To Africans, the opportunity was equally clear. Dignity could finally outweigh dependency. The world was watching, but Africa was deciding. The idea of an African gold reserve was still fragile, a blueprint more than a reality. Yet even as documents were drafted and meetings held in secret, the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with conviction. Farmers pledged part of their harvest to support the fund. Students painted murals of gold bars breaking free from chains. Soldiers who once hesitated now declared openly, "We stand with the people," but the road ahead was not paved with certainty. The West responded with escalation. Sanctions tightened. Trade routes were obstructed. International banks closed their doors. Every step towards independence invited another layer of resistance. Skeptics warned that Burkina Faso and its allies risked isolation, famine, even collapse. Some ministers whispered that without Western insurance or export markets, the plan could strangle economies before it saved them. Yet the counter-argument grew stronger with each act of defiance. "They already suffocate us," Traore reminded his advisors. "If sanctions feed no child and IMF loans build no future, what is there to lose?" His words struck a chord across the Sahel. For many, the choice was no longer between comfort and risk, but between chains and dignity. Concrete steps began to unfold. Engineers mapped sites for fortified vaults guarded by African soldiers. Economists drafted models showing how pooled reserves could anchor a regional currency shielded from manipulation. Quiet negotiations with BRICS partners explored refining technology and direct trade routes bypassing Europe. What once sounded like fantasy now took shape as survival strategy. The challenges were real. Without the infrastructure, progress would be slow. Without unity, sabotage could succeed. And without patience, the dream could crumble under pressure. But the spirit that had been awakened was not easy to extinguish. People no longer asked whether the reserve could succeed. They asked what role they would play in making it real. The symbolism mattered as much as the structure. In rallies, miners held their tools high, not as instruments of labor alone, but as symbols of resistance. Mothers brought baskets of grain to public gatherings, pledging them as offerings for a shared future. Youth chanted slogans that turned the idea of gold into the language of sovereignty itself. In the palace, Traoré framed the struggle in broader terms. "This is not about gold anymore," he told his generals. "It is about freedom itself." His conviction resonated beyond borders. Mali pledged uranium. Guinea considered bauxite. Niger spoke of oil. Piece by piece, a continental foundation was being laid, not yet in stone, but in determination. If the plan succeeds, the Sahel may one day guard not only its minerals but its future, on its own soil, under its own flag. If it fails, the cost will be severe. But the choice to try has already redefined the narrative. No longer supplicants at the doors of the IMF, Africa's leaders now stand as architects of their own destiny. If they succeed, it will not be just gold they guard. It will be freedom itself. They thought it was only gold. They thought seizing a shipment would bend a nation to its knees. But what was taken by force became the seed of something larger, a unity that no vault could contain. In losing its treasure, Burkina Faso discovered its strength. The African gold reserve is still a vision, yet already it is transformed into a symbol, not of wealth, but of sovereignty. Across the Sahel, miners, farmers, and students have claimed it as their own. They no longer see themselves as victims of global finance, but as guardians of a future that belongs to Africa alone. The world watches with skepticism. Western leaders warn of collapse. Economists predict failure. But for the people of Ouagadougou, this is no longer about forecasts or markets. It is about dignity. It is about a people refusing to bow when their wealth is treated as collateral. It is about a continent daring to say, "Our soil, our hands, our future." In this struggle, Ibrahim Traoré has become more than a head of state. He has become a voice echoing across borders, an emblem of defiance. What began as an Ibrahim Traoré coup against dependency has grown into a wider awakening, where the humiliation of one nation has lit the pride of many. It is no coincidence that people now speak of a Burkina Faso revolution, not only in the streets of Ouagadougou, but in the hearts of Africans from Bamako to Nairobi. The road ahead will be steep. Sanctions will bite, propaganda will spread, and attempts at division will not cease. But ideas once planted are harder to seize than gold. The reserve may be challenged, delayed, even attacked, but the spirit it has awakened will not vanish. This is not the end of the story. It is its beginning. Africa has been told for centuries to accept its fate. Today it answers with a different voice. A voice that says sovereignty is not charity, dignity is not debt, and freedom is not collateral. If this story stirs something in you, do not walk away. Subscribe, share, and stand with us as we follow the path of this new dawn. Because the Ibrahim Traoré coup is no longer only about Burkina Faso. It is about the future of a continent that refuses to bow.